This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host Gilad Halpern. Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Look for the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we simply cannot thank you enough. My guest today is a historian at the New School for Social Research in New York, specializing in American history. His latest book, Coca-Cola, Black Panthers, and Phantom Jets, Israel in the American Orbit, 1967 to 1973, was published in 2024 by Stanford University Press. Dr. Oz Frankel, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, and thank you for hosting me. It's a pleasure.
So your book deals with a critical period in the Americanization of Israeli society, but you understand the term Americanization in a very specific way. So before we move to discussing the case of Israel, can you start by saying what Americanization means to you?
Yeah, I'm very hesitant about the term Americanization. I think it's judgmental. It also assumes a process that concludes with making Israel part of the United States, and that's really not the case. I think one of the points that I'm trying to make in this project is that when we think about the relationship between the United States and Israel, or any other country in the world, we need to understand that America has changed radically over time. And so in this case, Israel. It's an ongoing process. So if we talk about Americanization, let's say since the 50s and 60s all the way to the 21st century, these are still very, very different kind of societies and cultures, and we need to acknowledge that. So I use the term from time to time, but it's a shorthand for much more complicated processes. I prefer the term encounter. Those two cultures, the two societies came together more intimately at the end of the 60s, the beginning of 70s, and it produced all kind of results. In some of them, you can see Israelis imitating American ways. In some, they reject American way or appropriate American ideas, customs, practices, and make them their own.
So what was it about that period in particular that made that encounter so valuable for you as a historian? I mean, obviously we all know the diplomatic context, but you're actually, well, not overlooking it, but seeing way beyond it, looking at the cultural and societal developments.
So for me, this began with the story of the Israeli Black Panthers. You know, it's a story that is well known to Israelis, less so in the United States. Usually the proverbial jaw drops when I tell my American interlocutors about the Israeli Black Panthers of 1971, especially American Jews, who are still very much concerned about the relationship between African Americans and Jews in this country.
And perhaps see Israel as an extension of their Ashkenazi identity.
Maybe, yeah. Right? And so
maybe you should say something about the Black Panthers for our listeners who perhaps are not aware of.
I'll just continue this train of thought. So there has been a literature about the Israeli Black Panthers, especially in Israel, of course. But what I thought was a little missing is the American side of things, especially this alliance that seemed to be dissolving by the end of the 1960s. It also raises the question of how the Israeli Black Panthers were able to scandalize Israeli society. We're talking about a group of unknowns, mostly men, but not only men in the late teens, early 20s, from a very, very poor neighborhood in Jerusalem. Most of them had only, 2, 3, 4 years of formal education and a long history with the police. So how this group was able to become so visible in Israeli society in 1971, 1972. And I associate this kind of visibility with the selection of the name Black Panthers.
It was a conscious adoption of their American counterparts?
It's a Rashomon story. There are all kinds of versions about how they came to adopt the name Black Panthers. And different individuals claim responsibility for this decision. I think at the beginning of the process, they knew very little about the Black Panther Party in the United States, but they touched a nerve, and the nerve was that by the late 1960s, the Israeli establishment was very concerned about the rise of Black militancy and the New Left. And the ostensible anti-Israeli attitude.
You're talking about outside of Israel.
Of course, I'm talking about the United States.
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking about the United States. Israeli press, if you read the Israeli press at the end of the 1960s, it's inundated with reports from the United States about the rise of anti-Semitism, Black anti-Semitism, New Left anti-Israeli attitude, and so on and so forth. To the degree that in Israel it became kind of a moral panic. And different predictions that Israel is now going to, witness mass immigration of Jews from the United States. So I think the concern for the Israeli establishment is that you will have the disaffected in Israel connecting themselves with anti-Israeli forces outside of the country. Otherwise, there's an element here that is really surprising. So this group of unknowns from Usrara in Jerusalem submitted a petition for a rally in Jerusalem, and this request goes all the way to the Prime Minister's office, where Golda Meir sits with the commissioner of the police and the mayor of Jerusalem to make a decision. And they decide not to allow this to happen. And this by itself, publicized this group like nothing else. Then it became an issue of freedom of speech. It became a scandal. The demonstration did take place in front of City Hall, Jerusalem, and all kinds of individuals who were not necessarily connected with this group arrived for the cause of freedom of speech. And so the group became very visible. There were many attempts to repress the group, but also to placate those individuals, offer them jobs. Many politicians met with them. Suddenly they were at the center of public attention in Israel. So to some extent, the selection of the term Black Panthers made it possible for the group to obtain this kind of public presence. And then came the consciousness, then came the understanding that there is something maybe similar between their plight and the predicament of African Americans in the United States. I mean, I asked this question throughout the book because this is not the only time that I deal with issues of race in the United States and the way they impacted Israeli society. How come, or through what process, the rift between blacks and whites in the United States became comparable or commensurable with the conflict between Ashkenazi and Mizrahi Jews in Israel? And who in Israel gets to be black? It doesn't seem that the Palestinians are labeled blacks in Israel. It's really an inner Jewish kind of a struggle. Right? Mm-hmm. But then again, I deal with other aspects of the racial story in the United States and the way it arrives in Israel. For instance, there's a major reform in Israeli education, labeled in beautiful Hebrew, reforma. And the center of that reforma is integratsia, that is integration. And to some extent, the model is the United States. And in order to facilitate this integration, we import an American institution, which is the middle school, right? When those two populations were expected to meet.
Looking at this specific period of the late 60s and early 70s is also a time when American influence is rising, cultural influence is rising everywhere across the world, perhaps the Western world. I mean, there's certainly, and I know that, as you said, you reject the term, but an Americanization process in Europe, or maybe it's not different from what we've seen in Europe at the same time.
That's an excellent question. Mm-hmm. So it happens in Europe immediately after the Second World War, with the Marshall Plan and the exposure of Europe, both the winning side and the losing side of the war, to American ways, American money, American way of doing business, organizing democracies, and so on and so forth. It was certainly very, very influential in France. France had also to contend with a wave of American imports. And Israel was very close to France before 1967, right, politically. What is different in the Israeli case? One thing that is different is that what we see, what I saw and try to document in my book is kind of triangle. This is not just United States and Israel. This is United States, then American Jewry, and then Israel. It's kind of triangle of relationship. They are often characterized by ambivalences and ambiguities. So Israelis want to get very, very close to American ways, consumerism for sure, maybe liberalism, maybe other aspects of American life that seem to be attractive, but also the United States appears on the Israeli horizon as a bad model because ostensibly it was a society that was falling apart, was marked by crime, racial tension, right?
It was not ideological as much as they wanted to
right,
be.
and some parts of the Israeli population were very, very concerned about, getting close to capitalism, hierarchy, social hierarchy, stratification, and all of that. And there was actually not a similar, but a parallel kind of ambivalence about American Jews. So on the one hand, American Jews really recruited themselves vigorously to help Israel after the Six-Day War, after the June 1967 war. And they arrived in Israel in greater numbers as tourists, as immigrants. Also, we have to remember that the country is led by a prime minister who grew up in Milwaukee. The Chief Justice Agranat was born in the United States and educated in Chicago. Eliu Katz, the sociologist, was in charge of establishing the Israeli TV. I can give you Tal Brody, professionalized Israeli basketball. There was a moment in the history of the country in which the American Jewish presence was stronger than before or maybe after. But there was ambivalence because Israelis were concerned about the sense that they are more dependent on American Jews than ever before, more dependent on their political support, but also more dependent on their donations. What was dismissed in Israel back then with the Yiddish term schnorr. And therefore, you see another instance of two Jewish communities that claim to be the promised land, right? And I think this is in part why the idea that American Jews are beleaguered, that they are under attack by anti-Semitism and maybe by assimilation, and maybe millions of American Jews will come to Israel, immigrate to Israel. It was a bit of a wishful thinking.
But again, I want to take it back to the question of the uniqueness of the Israeli case here. Yeah. Many years ago, I interviewed a British intellectual who wrote a book called Why Do People Hate America? It was right in the aftermath of the Iraq War. And one of his statements was that, again, about this ambivalence in the third world about America. On the one hand, they burn the American flag and they protest against America, but if they're given a green card, they will immediately take it. Do you see the Israeli attitude towards America and American Jews in the same vein, or is there something that goes deeper?
I don't think it's that extreme. But those ambivalences were part of the story that I'm trying to tell. I'm sorry, I'm also trying to tell stories of all kind of unsavory Jews that arrived to Israel at the time. For instance, the infamous gangster Meir Lansky, who comes to Israel in 1970 and tries to become a citizen based on the law of return, and then is being kicked out of the country after 2 years. Or someone, and there is a fear look, Israel back then, and maybe ever since, is prone to moral panics. So there was a fear that if we'll allow Lansky to stay, hundreds of American Jewish gangsters will exploit the law of return and come to Israel, make Israel the hub of international crime. And the same fear was about this group of African Americans who arrived in Dimona, the Black Hebrew Israelites, right? There are still a community in Dimona. They're quite thriving, and by now there are thousands of them. And they began arriving in 1969. And there was a fear that if we allow these people to stay in the country, millions of African Americans are going to leave the United States and immigrate to Israel, claiming that they are the descendant of the original 10 tribes of Israel. So all kind of fears about the membranes that separate Israel from the rest of the world. And this is after one war and before another, right? There's kind of sensitivity about what's inside and what's outside. Part of the anxiety about the Black Panthers is the idea that the Black Panthers are going to wash Israeli dirty laundry outside. They're going to embarrass us, right, globally, and how to prevent that from happening.
I want to ask you about again, the political context of all this, because I did ask you about Europe, and you said that it happened immediately in the aftermath of the Second World War.
It was a process that was, I think, particularly felt in the 1950s.
In the 1950s. So in the aftermath of the beginning of the Cold War and the Marshall Plan, etc. And in Israel, you're saying that perhaps one of the key milestones was the 1967 war, where Israeli and American relations became what they are, what they have been ever since. So is there a connection to, do you feel that it's like trickling down from the political realm into the societal and cultural realm in the same way?
Well, I don't know if it's trickling down. I think it's concurrent, and there are sort of cross influences from the political realm to the realm of culture, society, and politics. Before 67, France was, the ally, the big ally. And Israeli culture gravitated towards French culture, certainly in music, but also writing and so on and so forth. That changed after 1967. I'm not claiming that the Israeli case is radically different than other cases, but it has a few unique features. One of them is the Jewish side of things. Another is that Israel is in the state of war, maybe permanent state of war.
That is also interesting in itself, because counterculture in America and the rest of the West came against the backdrop of unprecedented prosperity, and quiet, right, and political harmony. Right. I mean, this is part of what made it emerge. And in Israel, that moment that you're talking about is right after the great victory of 1967. When militarism was all the rage, when the big cultural heroes and icons were generals. Right. How do you see the emergence of counterculture in Israel?
Before we talk about counterculture, we have to talk about consumerism.
Yes.
So a major theme in all the writing about the United States and the rest of the world is the way that American consumerism became globalized. And to some degree, this is the case in Israel. That begins before the war. So since the beginning of the 60s, there's a rise in the standard of living. Then there's the Mitun, the recession of 66, 67. And then the war ends the recession. And Israel experienced something that is unique, and I think stayed with Israel all the way to the present, is kind of militarism and consumerism, kind of schizophrenic existence that began with the war of attrition in the late 1960s. So this, something takes place on the Suez Canal, but then the rise of the standard of living is staggering. It's really quite amazing. David Horowitz, who was the governor of the Bank of Israel, said that Israel is the only country that is in the state of war, and still there's a rise in the standard of living.
You also write in your book that this decade, from the late 1960s to the 1970s, is the only one that social inequalities actually shrunk in Israel?
To some degree, yes. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. So So 3 of the chapters of my 10-chapter book are about consumerism. And it begins with all kind of, Coca-Cola was introduced to Israel only in 1968 and became the symbol of this rise in consumerism or Americanization, if you will. But there were other aspects of consumerism that arrived as well. But with consumerism, we see also consumer activism coming from the United States. So attempts to establish organization to control consumption and to educate the Israeli public in how to consume rationally.
Which is also very interesting because, as you also write, consumerism preceded capitalism to an extent.
Right.
I mean, we have to understand that all this did not come against the backdrop of a capitalist free market
not
like
at all.
it was in America. It was a very different structure of the Israeli economy.
Absolutely. And then I write a lot about how consumerism entered politics. I write about Shlomo Lahat's campaign in 1973. He became the mayor of Tel Aviv, and how he imported, or his campaign manager, Natan Brun, imported forms of electioneering that were clearly, came from the United States. Right, he had his image everywhere. He shook hands. He stood in intersections in Tel Aviv or went on the beach and shook. It
was a much more personalized campaign.
Yes, it was personalized, and he was, marketed as a commodity. And also all kind of other aspects of how to do politics arrived as well. Pollsters, focus groups, and so on and so forth. But by 1977, the Israeli electioneering system was profoundly professionalized. That also arrived from the United States. And so what we see is kind of consumerist ideas that enter different aspects of Israeli life, but also a consumerist order, advertisement, venues like department stores that arrived as well, high-end kind of consumerism, but also an anti-consumerist discourse that is very much of Israeli life back then, and huge concerns about Israel, that Israelis consume too much.
It's corrupting.
It's corrupting Israeli sense of equality and so on and so forth. But then I go elsewhere. I also write about the Israeli Air Force and the way it was a conduit for all kind of American ideas about management, about professionalism, and the encounter of Israeli pilots with the American Air Force. What happens to Israelis when they come to the United States? One thing that repeats itself endlessly is that one of the first things they do, they buy a car and they go on a trip. I mean, it's coming from a small country under siege to a huge country where cars are ubiquitous, right? That's the thing that is very attractive to Israelis right away upon their arrival.
What about the role of, Zionism and Aliyah, the negation of the exiles in that sense? I mean, there's something very attractive for Israelis about America. Yet there's this, also, again, as you said earlier, there's always this expectation that it won't go in that way, but rather the reverse, that American Jews will realize that they're stuck between, assimilation and anti-Semitism and see the light and come to Israel. How do Israeli intellectuals manage or reconcile this tension between this growing attraction by America and the loyalties to the political project that characterizes them?
One of the points I'm trying to make in the book is that the exposure to America, including American Jews, makes Israel more Jewish. Ironically, in the following sense, it's by the end of the 1960s. And that's, again, it's a unique moment in the cultural history of the state of Israel. We see Israeli culture gravitating towards roots, that is, exploring the East European past, including Yiddishism, and Hasidic folklore. They became, popular in Israel. And some of it has to do with things that happen in Israeli culture. Some of it has to do with what's going on in the United States at the very same time. the immense success of Fiddler on the Roof, for instance, in 1964. And then not just on Broadway, but it became a global phenomenon that amazed Israelis. And also there was a sense that Israelis were aware of what's going on culturally in the United States, that Yiddish becomes bon ton. And all of those famous stories about Pentagon generals talking about the bagel strategy in Vietnam. Or someone writing on the wall, Marcel Proust was a Yente in some campus. So, and I think this kind of exploring roots and moving away from the negation of the diaspora is a cultural process that is unfolding in conversation with American culture at the time. And we have I give all kind of examples. Is the immensely popular film Shnei Kuni Lemel, Two Kuni Lemels, that was had a whole shtetl being erected next to Tel Aviv. And by the end of the 60s, we have Hasidic song festival, Yiddish song festival, all this subject matter that was prohibited in Israel before the 60s. Right? Because there was a sense that we need to suppress Yiddish and East European culture. This subject matter became very visible by the end of the 60s. It was a fad. It then went away, but it was very, very visible. And also it's some kind of negotiation between those two cultures. Also the return to the fall, the Chazara B'Tshuva movement at the beginning of the process was predominantly American. Yeshivat HaTfutzot in Jerusalem was the first yeshiva in the world that was dedicated to bringing secular Jews back to the fold. And it was established and run by an American immigrant, Rabbi Mordechai Goldstein. Yes, so this is another thing that is unique to the Israeli story.
Yeah, to what extent does money got to do with it? I mean, part of the great involvement of American Jews in the Israeli project after 1967 involved a lot of philanthropic activity, and a lot of money went into Israeli initiatives. And then, as they say, follow the money. Usually money goes to initiatives that represent the interests of the people who give the money, right? So to what extent was a philanthropic giving central to these processes?
I think it was one dimension of this encounter. But also money became a problem. So Israelis were very busy fundraising in the United States, but there were all kinds of concerns about that. Also concerns that this money is used to launder unsavory, business dealing in the United States. The Lansky story, became an impetus for thinking in these terms. Who gives us money and why do they give us money? There are all kinds of questions about this. Why do I go so wide? Why do I visit so many aspects of this encounter? Is to argue ultimately that the American impact in Israel was diverse and moved even politically in very, very different directions. So usually when I give a lecture about this, I begin with two individuals, two immigrants, American immigrants from the United States. One is Rabbi Meir Kahane, right? The leader of the Jewish Defense League, ultra-nationalist and a racist who moves his operation to Israel around 1971.
And in many ways imports American racial structures.
Absolutely. He brought to Israel this kind of fears about sexual predatory behavior of Arabs toward Jewish women. So there's prejudice against Arabs before that in Israel. There's no doubt about that. But this kind of fear about sexual aggression is really an import from the American South. So we have him on the right side of things, and we have Marsha Friedman on the left side of things. So Marsha Friedman was an American immigrant. She actually arrived earlier, I think just before the Six-Day War. And she becomes by the very end of 1973, the elections took place at the last day of 1973, she becomes the first radical feminist to be elected to any legislature anywhere in the world. And feminism at the outset in Israel was largely an American phenomenon. So the texts were in English, and some of the discussions were in English. Especially in the Haifa group, there were three groups: Haifa, Tel Aviv, and Jerusalem. Each of them was a little bit different. I mean, the Jerusalem group was more connected to New Left and kind of French feminism, but Marsha Friedman's group had a few immigrants from the United States, and again, consciousness raising was done in English.
But that brings me again to my question earlier about the counterculture that we didn't address enough and would like you to do now. Because if we take Kahana and Marsha Friedman, I mean, at the time, well, Kahana is now the king of Israel, of course, but at the time, both were very marginal social phenomena, and they seemed like a foreign implant.
Right.
I mean, they gained
also was a resistance. I mean, they could be dismissed because they were Americans. So
exactly.
People say Israel was supposedly a country where, men and women were equal. I mean, there was the myth about the kibbutz.
Yeah, there was no need for feminism.
Right. There was no, we don't need feminism.
Yeah.
And also feminism is an American import.
Yeah.
It does not belong here.
So I'm wondering again about counterculture. Was it like in the same way? Because, counterculture, when you look at it in the late 60s in America against the backdrop of Vietnam, it's all about anti-establishment and anti-militarism, conscientious refusal and all those things that even for the progressive Israelis, the young progressive Israelis, was anathema, wasn't it?
Right. I think, counterculture in Israel was a work in progress. And certainly incomparable to what we see elsewhere in the West and in the United States. I mean, my sister, I have an older sister who in her room had a poster of Che Guevara. And that was an accoutrement of the 60s. Che was a handsome young man, very, very attractive. It's not a case that she subscribed to the same ideology as Che. And I think much of countercultural permutations in Israel were of that kind. So yes, rock and roll is great, and longer hair is great. Maybe some drugs, but not as much as in the United States. But the country was still, and then of course there were all kind of manifestation of resistance. The Michtav HaShminiot, the famous letter that high school seniors wrote to Golda Meir, in which they raised doubts about the commitment of the country to peace. But these were sporadic.
But would you qualify that as counterculture?
No, I'm talking counterculture, and I'm talking about radical oppositional politics. Mm-hmm. And I think both were quite restrained in Israel. I'm giving the example of Hair. I write
the musical
Hair. That in Israel was sensational. I mean, it was made a big splash, and Israeli went to watch this phenomenon. Although most of the people who went to watch Hair were older and more affluent, but at the end and there were all kind of discussions about the relevance of Hair to Israel, both as a cultural phenomenon and as a political phenomenon. Most commentators agreed that this is someone else's problems. That what we see here is what's going on in the United States, and this is not really relevant to our situation. There were other voices as well. I don't want to suppress them, but they were really on the margin of things. And of course, performers that participated in the staging of Hair were, faced all kind of remarks when they were walking in Dizengoff Street about their hair and about their clothing and so on. So Israel is a society that is very much aware of the outside, that is what's going on abroad. And Hair actually arrived to Israel even before the show was staged in Israel. And also...
Well, you mean the music on...
The music, I mean the soundtrack. And so Shir HaShalom, that's a famous peace song in the history of Israel was written, I think, as a response to her. And it became incredibly famous song and controversial song in the late 60s. And that was a song that was sung in the center of Tel Aviv just minutes before Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated, in the mid-1990s. So it had an impact on the culture, and some of it was oppositional and political, but I think ultimately rather limited.
So I think that one of the many valuable contributions that of your book is really looking at the so-called Americanization. Again, sorry for using this term, of Israel before the 1990s, because what people think is when the collectivist market opened up and the economy became more liberalized. This was one marker of the Americanization. Of course, Netanyahu's arrival on the political scene was another. And in a way, what you're saying is that it started way before that. And I want to ask you, how do you see that gap, the 20-year gap between the late 60s and the early 90s? In terms of maybe to take a broader historical look at it.
Right. If we are to be broader historically speaking, we need to go back to the beginning of the 20th century. So it really doesn't begin in the 1960s. Europe itself goes through a long process of quote-unquote Americanization that begins really in earnest in the 1920s and 1930s. It has to do with consumerism to a large extent. And it has to do with the supermarket and the department store and new ways of advertisement and aspects of civic society, service organization, Rotary that comes to Europe. So, and I think Zionism was also impacted by that since the beginning of the century. Also, someone like David Ben-Gurion stayed in this country for very, very long periods of time. And American Zionist organizations were very much part of the story of Zionism and the establishment of Israel. So it doesn't begin in the 1960s, but what we see in the 1960s is the intensification of this process. And the way it comes and enters different aspects of Israeli lives concurrently.
And the 1990s?
And the 1990s, I think it's another wave, it's another moment. It's not about Coca-Cola, it's about McDonald's. And it's further intensification, but I think it has a different verve. I think it's a different patina politically. I think it partakes in the making of the Israeli new liberalism, right? And then it's embodied by the current Prime Minister of Israel, Bibi Netanyahu. He stands for the Americanization of Israel. It's also, you see, a great impact of American conservatism on Israeli conservative politics. And that's different from the 60s and early 70s. Coming back to the point that I made at the beginning of this conversation is that there's no single process of Americanization. It's all historically textured. And we need to actually understand that.
And in order to do that, we can read your book. Oz Frankel, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And many thanks to Itai Shalem, the manager of TLV1 Studios. And now we've got a request, because most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. Good, bad, ugly, up to you. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has more than 1,000 interviews by now. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and now on Blue Sky as well. And most important, join us again next time for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.